The sky didn't burn that night because of the fire. It burned because someone decided her life was worth less than a building. Rain fell in slow, heavy sheets over downtown Chicago, turning the neon lights into blurred halos across the wet pavement. Alicia Monroe stood in front of her flower shop, her hand still holding a small metal watering can, frozen mid-motion as if time had lost its meaning. The scent of roses, lilies, and crushed petals filled the air around her, mixing with something harsher, smoke, heat, and the sharp crackle of collapsing wood. Across the street, cars slowed, headlights cutting through the mist like silent witnesses too afraid to stop. Somewhere behind her, a glass window finally gave way with a soft, distant pop, but she didn't turn. She didn't run. She just stood there, breathing steadily, her face illuminated by the orange glow reflecting off the rain. A few steps away, Ethan Caldwell stood beneath the awning of a closed cafe, his tailored coat damp at the shoulders, his expression unreadable. He was the kind of man people listened to without asking questions. Real estate empire, city contracts, boardrooms where decisions were made in silence that reshaped entire neighborhoods. But tonight, he wasn't speaking. He wasn't moving. He was simply watching. Alicia finally lowered the watering can, placing it carefully on the sidewalk as if the world hadn't already fallen apart. Her voice, when it came, was calm, almost too calm to belong to the moment. "You said this wouldn't happen," she said without looking at him. Ethan didn't answer immediately. His jaw tightened slightly, not in anger, but in something heavier, something harder to name. Around them, distant sirens began to rise, growing louder with each passing second, but still far enough away to feel unreal. A firefighter's light flashed briefly at the corner of the street, painting everything in white for half a heartbeat before fading again. Alicia's eyes stayed fixed on the burning shop, on the place where she had spent 8 years arranging life into color for other people's celebrations, funerals, apologies, and beginnings. "I gave you my word," Ethan finally said, his voice low, controlled, almost lost under the rain. Alicia let out a small breath, not a laugh, not quite a sigh, just something in between. "Your word doesn't stop fire," she replied. The wind shifted, carrying embers down the block like fading stars that had nowhere left to go. Ethan took a slow step forward, then stopped, as if the distance between them was suddenly something he wasn't allowed to cross. "This wasn't supposed to escalate like this," he said, more to himself than to her. Alicia turned her head slightly, just enough for him to see her profile, calm, steady, untouched by panic, though everything she owned was disappearing behind her. "That's what people always say after something burns," she said quietly. A crack of falling timber echoed from inside the shop, and for the first time, her shoulders moved, not from fear, but from acceptance. The kind that comes when there is nothing left to argue with. Ethan looked away for a moment, toward the street, toward the city lights stretching beyond them like nothing had changed at all, as if one small shop didn't matter in the scale of things he usually controlled. But something about the silence between them didn't agree with that thought. It pressed in, heavy, unrelenting. Alicia finally spoke again, softer this time. "You don't even know what you took from me." The words didn't carry accusation. They carried fact. And in that moment, as rain fell harder and the fire kept rising, Ethan Caldwell stood in the space between power and consequence, realizing for the first time that not everything destroyed can be measured in numbers. Rain kept falling long after the fire trucks arrived, as if the sky itself refused to accept what had already happened. Alicia Monroe stood a few steps back from the curb now, her fingers slowly loosening around the empty metal watering can she had forgotten she was holding. The world around her had shifted into something distant and unreal, voices blending with sirens, footsteps, and the crackling remnants of her flower shop turning into silhouettes of memory rather than reality. Ethan Caldwell had not moved far. He remained under the edge of the cafe awning, shoulders still damp. His gaze fixed on the place where the shop had stood, as if staring long enough might rewrite what had already been decided. The streetlights flickered above them, reflecting in puddles that trembled with each passing vehicle. Alicia finally spoke again, her voice steady but worn at the edges. "You stood there," she said, not asking, just stating it. "And you did nothing." Ethan's expression tightened slightly, not defensive, not angry, but burdened in a way that made him look older than he had a moment ago. "I did not authorize this," he said carefully, choosing each word like it carried weight beyond the moment. Alicia turned toward him fully now. The rain traced lines down her face, but she did not wipe them away. "Then someone who works for you did," she replied. The words hung in the air between them, heavier than the smoke still rising from the broken storefront behind her. A passing emergency light washed over Ethan's face in red and white, briefly revealing something unsettled in his eyes before it disappeared again. He looked down at the wet pavement, then back at her. "I am going to find out exactly what happened," he said, his voice quieter now, almost restrained. Alicia gave a faint nod, though there was no relief in it. "Finding out does not put anything back," she said. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The city continued moving around them, indifferent and loud, but the space between them felt isolated, like a sealed room no one else could enter. A firefighter walked past, speaking into a radio, mentioning structural damage and containment, words that meant everything and nothing at the same time. Alicia watched him disappear into the smoke, then turned her eyes back to what remained of her shop. "Do you know what that place was to me?" she asked quietly. Ethan hesitated. "A business," he said, though his tone made it sound like he already knew that answer was wrong. Alicia shook her head slowly. "It was where people came when they had nothing else to say, when they needed to apologize, when they needed to remember someone, when they were too afraid to speak and needed something living to do it for them." Her voice never rose, but every word felt deliberate, anchored in years rather than seconds. Ethan listened without interrupting, his hands now unclenched at his sides, rainwater dripping steadily from his sleeves. A distant thunder rolled over the city, low and continuous, but no lightning followed. "I did not want this neighborhood to become collateral," he said finally. Alicia looked at him for a long moment before answering. "That is what people say when they forget there are lives inside the numbers they calculate." The wind shifted again, carrying the smell of burnt wood farther down the street. A piece of charred paper lifted from the ground and spun between them before landing near Ethan's shoes. He did not step away from it. Instead, he stared at it as if it might say something back. Alicia's voice softened, though it carried no less weight. "You cannot stand here and separate yourself from what your decisions create," she said. "At some point, everything connects back to you." Ethan slowly raised his gaze to meet hers, and for the first time since the fire began, there was no confidence left in his expression, only the quiet realization that control did not extend as far as he had always believed. Ethan Caldwell did not speak for several seconds after Alicia's last words, as if the weight of them had temporarily taken away his ability to respond. The rain had softened into a steady, lingering drizzle, turning the streets into a reflection of fractured lights and blurred movement. Around them, cleanup crews began shifting into quieter routines, the urgency of the fire slowly dissolving into controlled motion and procedure, yet the space between Ethan and Alicia remained unchanged, suspended in something far more difficult to resolve. Alicia stood with her arms wrapped loosely around herself, not from cold alone, but from the exhaustion that comes when something deeply familiar is suddenly gone. Ethan finally exhaled, his breath visible in the damp air. "I need to see the reports," he said, more to himself than to her, as if structure and documentation could somehow anchor what he was feeling. Alicia glanced at him, her expression steady but distant. "Reports do not rebuild what people lose," she replied. A uniformed city inspector walked past them, briefly glancing at the charred remains of the storefront before continuing on without stopping. Ethan's phone vibrated in his pocket, but he did not check it. For the first time in a long time, whatever was waiting on the other side of that screen felt irrelevant. "I built this project to bring value to this area," he said, his voice lower now, less certain. "I was told there would be transitions, buyouts, agreements. Nothing like this." Alicia let out a quiet breath that was almost a laugh, but not quite. "That is always how it is told," she said, "until it is no longer just words." The rain continued to fall between them, soft but constant, like time refusing to pause for understanding. Ethan shifted slightly, stepping closer to the edge of the sidewalk where fragments of burned wood still lay scattered, dark against the wet concrete. He crouched slowly, picking up a small, partially melted piece of signage that once carried the name of the flower shop. He turned it in his hand, but said nothing. Alicia watched him without moving. That place was not just mine, she said after a moment. People came there when they were grieving, when they were celebrating, when they needed something real in a world that kept moving too fast. You cannot measure that in square footage or redevelopment plans. Ethan slowly stood again, holding the fragment loosely, then lowering it as if realizing it did not belong in his hand. I never intended to erase something meaningful, he said. Alicia met his eyes directly now. Intentions do not stop consequences, she replied. A siren echoed again in the distance, fading as quickly as it came, leaving only the sound of rain and distant traffic. Ethan looked away briefly toward the skyline, toward the buildings that represented everything he had spent years constructing in his mind as progress. For the first time, he seemed unsure of what that word even meant. Alicia turned slightly toward the remains of her shop once more. I am not asking you to understand everything tonight, she said, her voice softer now, but still firm. But I am telling you that what you build on top of this will always remember what stood here first. Ethan remained silent, the weight of her words settling between them like something neither rain nor distance could wash away. The night had deepened into a quieter version of itself, as if the city had finally accepted that nothing more could be undone in a single evening. Alicia Monroe stood near the remains of her flower shop, though calling it a shop now felt like a memory trying to describe itself. The rain continued its steady rhythm against broken surfaces and exposed metal frames, each drop sounding softer than the last, like exhaustion settling over everything it touched. Ethan Caldwell remained a few steps away, no longer under the cafe awning, now fully exposed to the weather, as if he had stopped trying to separate himself from the moment. His coat clung slightly to his shoulders, and his gaze remained fixed on the ground where fragments of what once was still rested in uneven silence. A response team member approached briefly, spoke a few words about containment and safety clearance, then moved on without waiting for acknowledgement. Neither Ethan nor Alicia reacted to the interruption. I need to understand how this escalated without oversight, Ethan said finally, his voice steady but lower than before, carrying less authority and more uncertainty. Alicia turned her head slightly toward him but did not fully face him. Understanding does not undo it, she said. The words were not sharp, but they landed firmly, like something already accepted as truth long before it was spoken. Ethan nodded once, though it seemed less like agreement and more like recognition of limitation. The streetlights above flickered faintly, reflecting off wet pavement in uneven patterns that shifted with passing cars. A small group of bystanders had gathered further down the block, speaking in hushed tones, but no one approached. The distance between observation and involvement remained intact. Alicia finally stepped forward, walking slowly along the edge of what used to be her storefront. Each step was careful, not hesitant, but deliberate, as if she were measuring what remained through presence alone. Ethan followed a few feet behind, without realizing he had started moving. You said you built something here to improve the neighborhood, she said without turning around. What does improvement look like when the people already here are no longer part of it? Ethan slowed, then stopped. The question did not sound like accusation. It sounded like calibration, as if she were trying to understand a logic that had failed to account for her existence. It was never supposed to remove anyone, he said. Alicia paused at the edge of a shattered planter box, looking down at soil mixed with rainwater and broken ceramic. But it did not protect either, she replied. Ethan's phone vibrated again, longer this time, persistent. He finally took it out, looked at the screen briefly, then turned it face down in his palm without answering. That small gesture carried more weight than any explanation he had offered so far. Alicia noticed it, but did not comment. Instead, she bent slightly and picked up a single surviving stem of a flower, bent but not broken, its color still faintly visible under the streetlight. She held it for a moment before placing it gently on the wet ground again. This is what people miss when they only look at outcomes, she said quietly. Not everything that matters survives in numbers. Ethan looked at the flower, then at her. For the first time, there was no attempt in his expression to correct, defend, or reposition. Only listening remained. The wind shifted again, carrying colder air through the street, and somewhere farther away, the city continued its normal rhythm, unaware or unwilling to pause. Alicia exhaled slowly, as if reaching the end of what she needed to say for now. If you stay here long enough, she added, you will start to see what was already here before you arrived. Ethan did not respond immediately. He simply stood in the rain, no longer separating himself from the space around him. As if for the first time he was no longer certain where his decisions ended and their consequences began. The rain had begun to thin into a mist that hung low over the street, softening the edges of everything it touched, as if the city itself was trying to blur the memory of what had just happened. Alicia Monroe stood still beside what remained of her flower shop, her hands now empty, her fingers slightly trembling only when she allowed herself to notice them. The ground beneath her was uneven, scattered with wet fragments of wood, glass, and soil, but she no longer looked for what was lost. She was simply standing inside the truth of it. Ethan Caldwell remained a short distance away, his posture less rigid than before, as though something in him had begun to lose its long-held structure. The confidence that once defined how he occupied space had not disappeared, but it no longer felt automatic. It felt questioned. A cleanup supervisor passed by them, speaking briefly into a handheld radio about perimeter clearance, then moved on without waiting for acknowledgement. The world around them continued to organize itself, but neither of them followed its rhythm. Alicia finally broke the silence. You keep saying you did not intend this, she said quietly, her voice steady but not soft. But intention does not decide what people live through. Ethan looked at her, and for a moment he did not respond. The words seemed to settle between them like something he could not dismiss or reframe. I am starting to understand that, he said at last, his voice lower than before, stripped of the firmness it usually carried. Alicia nodded slightly, as if acknowledging a step that was necessary but not sufficient. She walked slowly along the edge of the broken storefront again, her movements unhurried, not searching for anything in particular anymore, but rather marking the space as something that still belonged to her memory even if it no longer existed physically. Ethan followed at a distance that felt less like pursuit and more like uncertainty. People like you do not usually stand in places like this after hours, she said without turning. Ethan exhaled slowly. People like me usually do not have to see what happens after decisions are made, he replied. Alicia stopped walking, then turned halfway toward him. The streetlight above them flickered faintly, casting uneven shadows across her face. That is part of the problem, she said. Hey. Silence followed, not empty but dense, filled with everything neither of them had yet learned how to translate into words. A passing car slowed briefly, headlights sweeping across the sidewalk before continuing down the street, leaving them again in dimness. Ethan shifted his weight slightly, then spoke again, more carefully this time. I am going to find every person involved in what happened here, he said, and I am going to make sure this is addressed properly. Alicia studied him for a long moment, not reacting immediately. When she finally spoke, her tone remained even. Accountability is not the same as repair, she said. Ethan's gaze dropped briefly to the wet pavement before returning to her. Then what is repair? He asked. Alicia looked past him, toward the horizon of buildings and fading light. Repair is when what was taken is no longer missing in the lives of the people who depended on it, she said. The words did not carry anger. They carried clarity shaped by experience. Ethan did not respond right away. Instead, he looked back at the remains of the flower shop, now only shapes and shadows against the night. Something in his expression shifted, not dramatically, but enough to suggest that for the first time, he was no longer measuring the situation in terms of systems or processes, but in terms of absence. Alicia finally turned away again, continuing her slow walk along the edge of the damage. If you are still standing here tomorrow, she said quietly, you will need to decide whether you are observing what happened or becoming part of what comes next. Ethan remained where he was, the rain now almost gone, leaving only a lingering dampness in the air. For the first time since the fire began, he did not immediately look for a solution. He simply stayed still, listening to the silence that remained after everything else had already spoken. The city had settled into a quieter rhythm, the kind that follows destruction when there is nothing left to rush toward. Alicia Monroe remained near the edge of what used to be her flower shop, though by now it felt less like a place and more like an absence that refused to leave. The air was cooler, carrying the faint smell of wet ash and damp concrete, and the streetlights above had steadied into a dim, consistent glow. Ethan Caldwell stood a few steps away, no longer anchored to any single position, as if even standing still required more certainty than he currently had. His coat hung open slightly, untouched by urgency, and his attention drifted between Alicia and the broken remains of the storefront. A cleanup crew had begun placing temporary barriers around the area, but their movements were slow, almost respectful, as if even they understood that this was not just a structural incident. Alicia finally broke the silence without turning to him. "You have been standing there for a long time," she said calmly. Ethan exhaled, as if realizing only then that time had been passing differently for him. "I am trying to understand where responsibility begins," he replied. Alicia nodded faintly, still looking at the empty space where her shop had once stood. "Responsibility begins long before understanding," she said. The words did not carry accusation, only clarity. A light breeze moved through the street, shifting loose debris slightly across the sidewalk. Ethan looked down at his hands for a moment, then back toward her. "I have spent years believing that structure prevents outcomes like this," he said. Alicia turned slightly now, just enough for him to see her expression. It was not anger. It was exhaustion shaped into focus. "Structure only matters if it accounts for the people inside it," she said. Ethan did not respond immediately. The distance between them felt unchanged, yet something inside that distance had begun to shift. A passing city official briefly approached the cordoned area, exchanged quiet words with another worker, and left without engaging either of them. The world continued its administrative motion, but neither Ethan nor Alicia followed it. Alicia stepped forward again, walking slowly along the edge of the debris field, as if tracing the outline of something that no longer existed but still defined her. Ethan followed at a slower pace, not closing the distance, but not leaving it either. "You are not asking the right question," she said. After a moment, Ethan looked at her, waiting. Alicia continued, her voice steady and grounded. "You keep asking how it happened. The real question is why no one thought about what it would feel like when it did." Ethan paused, the words settling heavily in the space between them. A distant sound of a passing train echoed through the city, low and continuous, fading as quickly as it arrived. He turned his gaze back toward the remains of the flower shop. "If I had known," he began, then stopped, as if the sentence itself no longer held value. Alicia shook her head slightly. "Knowing after does not change what someone lives through in the moment," she said. The wind shifted again, carrying a faint coolness through the street. Ethan slowly stepped closer to the edge of the storefront, stopping just short of where Alicia stood. For the first time, he was not trying to observe or analyze the scene. He was simply present inside it. Alicia looked at him briefly, then returned her gaze forward. "Tomorrow," she said quietly, "this will become a report for you. But for me, it will still be the place where something ended." Ethan did not respond. The silence that followed was no longer empty. It was filled with the weight of everything that had already been said and everything that could no longer be undone. The night had fully settled into a quiet stillness that no longer felt temporary, as if the city had accepted that what happened earlier would remain part of its memory, whether it acknowledged it or not. Alicia Monroe stood near the edge of the cordoned space, her silhouette faint under the steady glow of streetlights that reflected off wet pavement. The remains of her flower shop were now surrounded by temporary barriers, marking a boundary between what was gone and what others would soon begin to manage as procedure. Ethan Caldwell stood several feet away, no longer pacing, no longer searching for words in the air between them. His stillness had changed over time, becoming less like control and more like uncertainty held in place. Alicia finally spoke without turning. "You are waiting for something that will not come," she said quietly. Ethan looked at her, his expression restrained but no longer distant. "I am waiting for clarity," he replied. Alicia nodded once, slowly. "Clarity does not arrive when you ask for it. It arrives when you are ready to accept what it costs." A brief silence followed, filled only by the faint sound of distant traffic moving through intersecting streets. Ethan shifted his stance slightly, his attention moving from her to the broken remains and back again. "I have reviewed initial reports," he said carefully. "There are gaps. No direct authorization tied to my office. But there are connections that lead to contracted oversight." Alicia finally turned to face him fully. Her expression remained calm, but there was something firmer in it now, something that no longer waited for explanation. That is how systems protect themselves, she said. They distribute responsibility until no one feels it anymore. Ethan did not respond immediately. The words seemed to settle into him in a way that did not allow for immediate rebuttal. A passing maintenance vehicle slowed briefly near the barricades, its headlights sweeping across the scene before continuing onward, leaving them again in dim stillness. Alicia stepped closer to the edge of what remained of her shop, her movements deliberate, as if each step confirmed that she was still present inside something that had already ended. "You keep looking for the moment where something went wrong," she said. "But I am standing in the result of every moment that was ignored before it." Ethan's gaze lowered slightly. For the first time, there was no immediate response forming behind his expression. The certainty he once carried in professional environments no longer translated here. "If I could reverse what happened," he began, then stopped again, as if the language itself felt insufficient. Alicia shook her head gently. "Reversal is not the question," she said. "Responsibility is what remains when reversal is impossible." The wind moved through the street again, lifting small fragments of debris and carrying them a few feet before letting them fall back into place. Ethan looked toward the empty storefront, now reduced to outlines and memory. "What happens next?" he asked quietly. Alicia paused, her eyes fixed on the space in front of her. "What happens next depends on whether you are here to observe damage or to understand impact," she said. Ethan did not answer immediately. Instead, he remained still, allowing the silence to exist without interruption. For the first time since the fire, the moment between them was no longer about explanation or defense. It was about recognition of what could not be undone and what would now define everything that followed. The night had settled into a deeper silence, the kind that follows long emotional wait rather than the passing of time. Alicia Monroe stood near the edge of the barricaded flower shop, her presence still steady even as everything around her had shifted into remnants and memory. The streetlights above no longer flickered, now holding a consistent glow that reflected off the wet pavement like a calm surface trying to mask what had unfolded beneath it. Ethan Caldwell remained nearby, no longer measuring distance between himself and the scene, but instead standing inside it without the comfort of separation. His posture had softened over the past moments, not in defeat, but in a quiet recalibration of something internal that no longer aligned with certainty. Alicia broke the silence without turning. "You are still trying to turn this into something you can solve," she said calmly. Ethan looked at her, his voice lower than before. "I am trying to understand what responsibility looks like when it cannot be reversed," he replied. Alicia nodded slowly, as if acknowledging the sincerity of the question but not granting it comfort. "Responsibility is not about solving what is already broken," she said. "It is about what you choose to do when you can no longer pretend it is separate from you." A light wind passed through the street again, moving small pieces of debris along the sidewalk in short, irregular motions. Ethan exhaled slowly, his gaze shifting from her to the remains of the storefront and back again. "I have initiated a full internal review," he said. "Every contractor involved will be examined. Every decision pathway will be traced." Alicia finally turned toward him, her expression steady and grounded. "That is process," she said, "not repair." Ethan paused, absorbing the distinction without rushing to defend it. A city vehicle passed slowly behind them, its tires rolling through shallow water, producing a sound that briefly filled the space before fading into distance again. Alicia stepped closer to the boundary of the damaged area, her movements unhurried, as if she was no longer reacting to what had happened but defining how it would be remembered. "You keep speaking as if everything that happened here belongs to systems," she said quietly. "But I am standing in what those systems do when no one is watching closely enough." Ethan's eyes lowered for a moment before returning to her. The confidence that once shaped his responses no longer surfaced automatically. "If I had been present earlier in the chain," he began, then stopped, as if the sentence itself no longer held weight. Alicia shook her head gently. "Presence is not the same as awareness," she said, "and awareness is not the same as impact." The silence that followed was no longer heavy in a dramatic sense, but instead precise, like a space where language had reached its limit. Ethan looked again at the broken structure, the outlines of what had once been a place filled with life and purpose. "What do you want from this now?" he asked quietly. Alicia did not answer immediately. Her gaze remained forward, steady on the empty space where her flower shop once stood. When she finally spoke, her voice carried no anger, only clarity. "I want what remains of this to mean something that prevents it from repeating," she said. Ethan stood still, the words settling into him without resistance. For the first time, there was no attempt to reorganize, reframe, or control the outcome of what was being said. Only understanding remained in its earliest form, unshaped and unresolved, as the night continued around them without interruption. The night had finally reached a point of stillness where even the city's distant noise felt softened, as if everything that had happened earlier was being held in suspension rather than resolution. Alicia Monroe stood at the edge of what remained of her flower shop, her figure calm but grounded in something deeper than emotion, something closer to acceptance shaped by experience. The barricades around the site reflected faint streetlight, marking a boundary that now separated memory from the ongoing movement of the city. Ethan Caldwell remained beside her, no longer speaking immediately, as if words required more care than he had previously understood. His posture had changed subtly over the course of the night, less rigid, less certain, more attentive to what could not be controlled through structure or process. Alicia finally spoke without looking at him. "You have been trying to categorize everything since this began," she said quietly. Ethan exhaled slowly. "I have been trying to ensure nothing like this happens again," he replied. Alicia nodded once, acknowledging the intention without accepting its completeness. "Prevention is not the same as understanding what already happened," she said. A long silence followed, filled only by the distant sound of passing vehicles and the soft movement of wind through the empty street. Ethan looked toward the remains of the storefront, now reduced to outlines and shadowed shapes beneath steady light. "Then tell me what understanding requires," he said. Alicia turned slightly toward him for the first time in several moments. Her expression carried no urgency, only clarity. "It requires you to stop standing outside of it," she said. Ethan remained still, absorbing the meaning without interruption. The space between them felt less like distance now and more like transition, as if something unresolved had finally been named. A cleanup crew quietly adjusted barriers further down the block, their movements slow and procedural, avoiding the center of what remained untouched. Alicia stepped forward again, closer to the edge of the damaged ground, her attention resting on what could no longer be restored but still demanded acknowledgement. "This place mattered before it was part of any plan," she said. "It mattered to people who never appeared in your reports." Ethan lowered his gaze briefly before responding. "I am beginning to see that my perspective was incomplete," he said. Alicia did not respond immediately. Instead, she looked out across the street, where the city continued its normal rhythm, unaffected in appearance but not in consequence. "Incomplete perspectives are not the issue," she said. "The issue is what they fail to include when decisions are made." The wind shifted again, carrying a faint chill through the street, moving small fragments of debris along